This is a story about a battle in ancient China. Get comfortable, you don't need to remember any of it. Just let it carry you somewhere quiet, somewhere far from tonight, and somewhere you don't have to come back from until morning. The Salt Roads. Laying plans. The kingdom of Aviath had no army worth the name when the Ostrith Confederation crossed the Dunmark Hills in the third year of King Belen's reign, and everyone who mattered in the capital agreed, in the hushed and panicked way that important men agree on things they do not wish to say aloud, that the war was already lost. Everyone except Inez Corvain, who had spent the last 11 years of her life not as a soldier, but as the keeper of the royal salt monopoly, a position her father had held before her and his father before him, a position considered so thoroughly unglamorous that no one in the royal court had bothered to notice, until it was far too late to matter, that the woman who controlled every salt road, every preservation house, every trade agreement with every coastal village from the Farron Strait to the Dunmark foothills, knew more about the actual geography and loyalty and hunger of the kingdom than any general who had ever drawn a map of it. She was summoned to the War Council not because anyone believed she had anything useful to contribute, but because King Belen's steward, in a fit of desperate thoroughness 3 days after the Ostrith vanguard was sighted, had decided to summon everyone with a royal office of any kind, salt included, on the theory that a kingdom facing annihilation could not afford to overlook a single resource, however unlikely. "We have 4,000 men," said General Tavro Reis, the commander of what remained of Aviath's standing army, addressing the council with the flat exhaustion of a man who had already calculated the odds and did not like repeating them. "The Ostrith field 22,000, perhaps more by the time they cross the Dunmark passes. We cannot meet them in open battle. We cannot hold every border fort with the men we have. Our choices, as I see them, are surrender on the best terms we can negotiate, or a slow retreat that buys the capital perhaps 2 months before it too falls." "There is a third choice," Inez said, from the far end of the table, where she had been given a seat mostly out of politeness, which is that we do not fight the war General Reis is describing at all. The council turned to look at her, the way men look at a child who has spoken out of turn at a funeral, not with anger, precisely, but with the particular embarrassment of people who had forgotten she was in the room. "Salt Keeper," said Lord Marson, the king's chancellor, not unkindly, "this is a matter for the general staff." "I am aware," Inez said, "that this is not customarily a matter for the Salt Keeper, but I would ask the council to consider one fact before dismissing me, which is that the Ostrith Confederation is not a kingdom, whatever it calls itself. It is 9 separate clan hosts, held together by exactly one thing, which is a shared belief that this campaign will be short, profitable, and largely bloodless, because they believe, correctly at present, that Aviath cannot meet them in the field and will therefore either surrender quickly or collapse under a fast, decisive strike. Every one of their commanders has told his own clansmen this. It is, in fact, the only reason 9 mutually suspicious clan lords have agreed to march together at all, the promise of an easy war. And, Reis said, not unkindly either, but with the particular patience of a soldier listening to a civilian describe warfare. "And I have spent 11 years learning exactly how far every salt shipment in this kingdom travels, how long each preservation house can hold its stores, which coastal villages owe us favors, and which owe the Ostrith clans favors of their own, and which mountain passes flood in autumn rain badly enough that an army trying to resupply through them will find itself, within 6 weeks, eating horses instead of grain. I do not propose we fight this war with 4,000 men against 22,000. I propose we do not let it become the war they believe they are fighting at all. A waging war. King Bilen, when the matter was finally brought before him, a young king, not yet 30, still uncertain enough of his own authority that he tended to defer to whichever adviser spoke last and most confidently, asked Inez the only question that mattered. What do you need? 6 weeks, Inez said, and every salt cart, grain barge, and coastal trading vessel currently under royal license, which is to say, nearly everyone in the kingdom. And I need General Rias's 4,000 men to do almost nothing that looks like fighting for most of that time, which I suspect will be the hardest part of this plan to arrange, since soldiers are trained to want to fight and generals are trained to want them to. Rias, to his credit, did not object on principle, though his jaw tightened in the particular way of a professional soldier being asked to set aside everything his training had taught him. Explain it to me as though I were a farmer, salt keeper, because I do not yet understand a single piece of what you are proposing. 22,000 men eat, roughly, 22,000 men's worth of food every single day, Inez said. That is not a metaphor, General. It is an arithmetic problem, and it is the only arithmetic problem that actually matters in this war. An army of that size cannot carry more than perhaps 3 weeks of supply with it. The wagons alone would be longer than the marching column. Which means that from the day they cross the Denmark passes, the Ostrith host is entirely dependent on foraging and resupply from the territory they are marching through, which is to say from us, whether we intend it or not, because every village they pass through either surrenders its stores willingly or has them taken by force, and either way our own grain ends up feeding their army. So we are going to stop that from happening without ever meeting them in a single battle. Every preservation house between the Denmark foothills and the capital is going to be emptied, quietly in the next 10 days, not burned, which would tell them plainly that we are denying them supply and provoke exactly the fast, punitive advance we cannot survive, but simply and unremarkably relocated, the way any prudent kingdom moves its grain reserves when war approaches, so that by the time their vanguard reaches any given village, there is simply nothing there worth the trouble of stopping to take. Every coastal village with a fishing fleet is going to be quietly compensated from royal coffers to spend the next 6 weeks fishing far out past the Farren Shoals rather than close to shore, so there are no boats worth commandeering along the coast road the Ostrith will need for a secondary supply line. And every mountain pass east of the Denmark foothills that floods reliably in autumn, which is 4 of the 7 usable passes, General, a fact I suspect the Ostrith scouts do not know, because it is precisely the kind of thing only a salt keeper who has spent a decade routing carts through those passes would think to check, is going to have its drainage channels quietly blocked over the next 2 weeks by men who look, to any distant observer, exactly like farmers clearing irrigation ditches for the season. You mean to starve them, Rias said slowly. I mean to make them starve themselves, Inez said, by letting them do exactly what a confident, quick victory army always does, which is advance faster than its supply lines can comfortably follow, secure in the belief that the countryside will feed it as it goes. We are simply going to make sure the countryside cannot, in ways subtle enough that by the time any single Ostrith commander realizes the pattern, 6 weeks will already have passed, and his men will already be eating less than they need, in weather turning colder, in territory where every pass east is now a half-flooded bog instead of a road. Attack by stratagem. The 9 Ostrith clan hosts crossed the Dunmark passes in the second week of autumn, exactly as confidently as Inez had predicted, led by a coalition of commanders whose only real point of agreement was contempt for the kingdom they were marching to conquer. Their overall commander, insofar as 9 jealous clan lords could be said to have one, was a grizzled warlord named Kettrig Vane, whose reputation had been built on 3 decades of fast, decisive campaigns against exactly the kind of overmatched, poorly defended kingdoms that Aviath appeared on paper to be. He had planned this campaign the way he had planned every campaign of his career: identify the enemy's largest force, seek battle quickly before they could consolidate, win decisively, and let the speed and violence of the victory do the work of holding the conquered territory afterward, since a beaten people rarely revolt against a conqueror who has already demonstrated, once and thoroughly, exactly what resistance costs. The trouble, though Vane did not recognize it as trouble for some time, was that General Rias's 4,000 men refused to provide the decisive battle his entire strategy depended on. They did not retreat to the capital, which would have been the expected, if cowardly, response. Instead, they withdrew in good order to a series of fortified positions along the higher ground east of the Dunmark foothills. Positions chosen, though Vane's scouts could not have known this, specifically because Inez had identified them years earlier as the driest, most defensible ground along routes that would flood if the passes below them were blocked, and simply held those positions, refusing every attempt Vane made to draw them into open battle. While offering no target large or careless enough to be worth the cost. Love a direct assault against fortified high ground. They are cowards, said Harn Dalgath, one of Vane's rival clan commanders, at a war council held on a cold night 3 weeks into the campaign, in a camp that had begun, in ways none of the assembled lords wished to discuss openly, to run somewhat short of the easy foraging they had all expected. We should bypass their little garrison entirely and march directly on the capital. 4,000 men skulking on a hilltop cannot stop 20,000 from simply walking past them. They are not cowards, Vane said, with the particular unease of a man beginning dimly to suspect he had walked into a trap he could not yet see the shape of. Cowards run. These men are not running. They are waiting for something, and I do not yet know what. What they were waiting for, though Vane would not learn this until it was catastrophically too late, was the arithmetic Inez had explained to Rias 6 weeks earlier, now finally coming due. The preservation houses along the Ostrith line of march had, one by one, over the preceding month, turned out to be empty or nearly so, not burned, not obviously denied, simply and mundanely relocated in ways that looked, to any Ostrith quartermaster investigating a given village, like the ordinary prudence of a kingdom moving its stores away from an advancing army, a thing every kingdom in every war had always done and would always do. Provoking no particular alarm because it was exactly what any of them would have expected. The coastal fishing villages, when Ostrith foragers reached the coast road hoping to seize boats and stores, found fleets that had, for reasons no one could quite explain, taken unusually strongly to fishing the deep waters past the Farren Shoals this particular autumn, leaving little behind worth the trouble of requisitioning. And the mountain passes east, 4 of the 7, precisely the 4 that would have offered the fastest resupply route back to Ostrith territory once the autumn rains began in earnest, had, by the 6th week, become exactly the flooded, half-impassable bogs that Inez had known they would become, not through any sabotage that could be traced to Aviath soldiers, but through nothing more than blocked drainage channels that any careful observer would have attributed to nothing more sinister than neglected farmland and an unusually wet season. By the 7th week, Kettrig Vane's host of 22,000 men had eaten through nearly all the supply they had carried with them, had found the countryside far less generous in foraged stores than any previous campaign of his long career had prepared him for, and had discovered, with growing and finally undeniable alarm, that the fastest routes back toward Ostrith territory were now choked with autumn floodwater that made resupply columns from home a matter of weeks rather than days. "We should retreat now, while retreat is still possible," Dalgeth said, at a council that had grown considerably more subdued than the one 3 weeks prior, before the passes flood entirely, and this campaign becomes a war against starvation rather than against Aviath. "If we retreat now," Vane said, "having taken no city, won no battle, and gained nothing for 6 weeks in the field, every clan lord in this tent will return home having proven to his own people that this entire alliance was a fool's errand, and the Confederation itself may not survive the winter's recriminations." It was, Inez had calculated from the very beginning of her plan, exactly this dilemma that would eventually break Vane's coalition apart far more thoroughly than any battle could have, not a defeat in the field, which might have united 9 proud clanlords in shared grievance against Aviath, but a slow, humiliating, undeniable failure that offered no enemy to blame it on, and therefore left each clanlord free to blame one another instead. Tactical dispositions. What broke the siege in the end was not a battle at all, but a single carefully arranged trade agreement offered by Inez Corvain in her official capacity as Royal Salt Keeper, a role so tediously unmilitary that it had allowed her, for the entire duration of the campaign, to travel under safe passage to negotiate with coastal villages and border communities that no Ostrith commander thought to restrict, since salt keepers negotiated trade, not war. And had done so across every border in living memory, regardless of whatever conflicts happened to be underway above their heads. In the 8th week of the campaign, with Vane's host reduced to strict rationing and growing daily more fractious, Inez arranged, through intermediaries so carefully layered that no direct connection to the royal court could be traced by anyone looking for one, a private offer to Harn Dalgeth specifically, the most restless and ambitious of Vane's rival clan commanders, safe passage home for his clan host alone, along with a modest but very real shipment of grain, to see his people through the winter, in exchange for nothing more than his early, quiet withdrawal from the coalition, framed not as desertion, but as prudent, independent judgment that the campaign had become unwinnable. Dalgeth took the offer within 3 days of receiving it, withdrawing his clan host of some 3,000 men under cover of a bitter, very public argument with Vane over strategy, an argument Inez had, in truth, done a great deal of quiet work over the preceding weeks to ensure would happen. Through rumors carried by traders in Vane's own camp, suggesting that Vane intended to blame the campaign's failure on Dalgath's clan, specifically when it came time to explain the disaster to the wider Confederation. Dalgath's withdrawal, once it happened, could not be concealed from the rest of the coalition, and it did precisely what Inez had calculated it would do. It gave every other clan lord in Vane's camp both the excuse and the model for doing exactly the same thing. Within 2 more weeks, as the autumn rains deepened and the flooded passes made resupply from home increasingly desperate, 4 more clan hosts had negotiated their own quiet withdrawals, each believing, since Inez's intermediaries were careful to make it appear so, that they alone had secured a private and advantageous arrangement, each unaware that 4 other clan lords had received nearly identical offers, each convinced that early departure was shrewd self-interest rather than what it actually was. Which was the specific and deliberate unraveling of a coalition that had never been held together by anything stronger than the shared expectation of an easy war. By the time the first hard frost arrived in the 10th week of the campaign, Kettrig Vane commanded perhaps 8,000 men of the 22,000 he had crossed the Dunmark passes with, a force still, on paper, twice the size of Rias's garrison, but a force that had eaten through its supply, lost half its coalition to quiet defection, and now faced the genuine prospect of being cut off entirely from any line of retreat as the last passable mountain pass began, in its turn, to show the first signs of the same flooding that had claimed the others. Alanurgy. It was at this point, and not a moment before, that General Rias's 4,000 men finally moved from their fortified positions to something resembling actual battle, though even now, Inez insisted, it must not be the decisive all-or-nothing engagement that Vane, in his desperation, would have welcomed as a chance to salvage something from the ruin of his campaign through one last, valorous, coalition-uniting battle. He wants exactly what you are about to offer him, Inez told Rias, on the eve of what the histories would later, somewhat inaccurately, call the Battle of Dunmark Gap. A single great clash, honorably fought, that lets him tell whatever remains of his shattered coalition that Aviath met them in open battle and was only narrowly, gloriously defeated, or, if he loses, that he was overwhelmed by superior numbers rather than starved and abandoned by his own allies. Neither story is better for his purposes than the true one. We are not going to give him that story. Then what battle are we fighting? Rias asked, with the particular weariness of a general who had spent 10 weeks holding a position while being told, repeatedly, not to attack, and now found himself being told, on the very eve of finally attacking, that the attack itself must somehow not resemble an attack. A short one, Inez said. You will engage his rearguard specifically, the weakest, most exhausted portion of his remaining host, the men closest to the flooded pass he is desperately trying to keep open for his retreat, and you will press that engagement hard enough to convince him that his line of retreat is genuinely at risk of being cut off entirely, which is true, but you will not press it to destruction. You will let him withdraw the bulk of his remaining force back through that pass in disorder and haste, abandoning wagons, abandoning the wounded, abandoning whatever supply remains to him, because a commander convinced his retreat is about to be severed will always choose speed over dignity, and a hasty, humiliating retreat through a half-flooded pass, undertaken by a starving remnant of a once great coalition. tells every clan lord who eventually hears of it a story that no Ostrith bard will ever be able to make sound like anything other than what it actually was, a catastrophe, entered into confidently and left in ruin, without Aviath ever having needed to destroy the army that caused it. "You want us to let them escape," Rias said, disbelieving. "I want them to escape exactly badly enough," Inez said, "that no one in the Ostrith Confederation ever again looks at this kingdom and sees an easy war. A destroyed army creates martyrs and grievances that unite a people in vengeance for a generation. A humiliated army that straggled home starving, having lost half its strength to its own allies' desertion, and the rest to a campaign it never should have attempted, creates nothing but recrimination, embarrassment, and 9 clan lords who will spend the next decade blaming one another rather than plotting a second invasion of us. That is the victory I want, General, not a triumph, an embarrassment so thorough that no one wishes to repeat it." Weak points and strong. The engagement at Dunmark Gap, when it came, lasted less than 4 hours and was, by the standards of the great battles that filled the histories of that era, a minor and almost undignified affair, a hard, bloody skirmish against an exhausted, half-starved rearguard, fought in freezing rain, ending not in the annihilation of Vane's remaining force, but in its headlong, disorganized flight through a mountain pass that had, by the time the last stragglers reached it, become a genuine hazard to cross, claiming, by some accounts, nearly as many lives to flood and cold as the fighting itself had. Kettrig Vane survived the retreat, though barely, and returned to Ostrith territory that winter commanding perhaps 5,000 men of the 22,000 he had led south with such confidence in early autumn, a catastrophe so total, and so plainly the result of his own strategic misjudgment rather than any battlefield defeat inflicted by Aviath, that the confederation that had briefly united 9 clan hosts under his banner did not survive the recriminations that followed. Dalgith, whose early and profitable withdrawal had looked, in the moment, like shrewd self-preservation, found himself instead accused by the other returning clan lords of having abandoned the coalition at its moment of greatest need, a charge that carried enough weight, once the full scope of the disaster became clear, to cost him much of his standing among his own people. Within the year, the Ostrith Confederation had fractured into open feuding among its constituent clans, several of whom found themselves, in the years that followed, considerably more interested in securing peaceful trade agreements with Aviath's salt roads and grain markets than in any further talk of conquest, a state of affairs that Inez Corvain, watching from her office in the capital, found rather more satisfying than any triumphal parade could have been. "You should be a general," King Belen told her, at the small and deliberately understated victory feast held that winter, deliberately understated, at Inez's own insistence, because a kingdom that had just survived invasion by making its enemies' defeat look like an accident of the enemy's own poor judgment had no business celebrating loudly enough to suggest otherwise. "I have no interest in generalship," Inez said. "A general's victories are written in blood and remembered in songs, and both of those things cost more than they are worth, if there is any way at all to avoid them. I would rather be remembered, if I am remembered at all, as the salt keeper who kept the roads running through a difficult autumn, which is a duller story and considerably cheaper, and has the added advantage of being almost entirely true." Maneuvering. She returned to her office the following morning, in fact, and resumed the ordinary business of the royal salt monopoly, inspecting preservation houses, adjudicating disputes between coastal fishing villages over shoal rights, negotiating the annual grain for salt exchange with the highland farming communities, as though the entire campaign of the preceding autumn had been merely an unusually demanding season rather than a war that had, by any honest reckoning, saved the kingdom from conquest. It was General Reyes, some years later, long after Inez Corvain had died, peacefully in her own bed, having spent the remainder of her long life exactly as she said she would, tending salt roads and grain contracts with the same quiet attention she had once turned toward the arithmetic of an invading army's supply lines, who tried, in his own retirement, to set down some account of what had actually happened that autumn, for the benefit of whatever young officers might someday face a war they could not hope to win by conventional means. "The mistake every young soldier makes," he wrote, in a private memoir that circulated only among a small circle of officers for several decades before finding its way, much later, into a wider and more permanent record, is to believe that war is decided by the battle. It is not. War is decided by the arithmetic that makes the battle necessary or unnecessary in the first place, by supply, by morale, by the fragile and mostly unspoken agreements that hold any coalition of allies together, by the countryside itself, which feeds or starves an advancing army according to choices made by farmers and fishermen and merchants who never once picked up a weapon. Inez Corvain understood this before I did, before the king did, before Keter. Igvain, to his great cost, ever came to understand it at all. She never fought a battle in her life, in the sense that soldiers mean the word. She fought a war instead, in the sense that mattered, which is to say she made an enemy defeat himself through his own confidence, his own hunger, his own fracturing alliances, long before either army drew close enough to trade a single blow, and by the time the fighting finally came, it was so small and so brief that most of the actual war had already been decided, quietly, in preservation houses and fishing villages, and mountain drainage channels that no history of great battles would ever think to mention. "I have commanded soldiers in 6 campaigns since that autumn," Reyes continued, "and I have won some of them and lost others, and in every single one, win or lose, I have found myself returning to the same question Inez Corvain taught me to ask before any other. Not how do we win this battle, but what does the enemy actually need in order to keep fighting at all, and how do we make sure he does not get it, in ways so ordinary and so unremarkable that he does not even notice we have taken it from him until it is already gone. It is not a soldier's question. It was never meant to be. It came from a woman who spent her life managing salt and grain and the small mundane trades that keep a kingdom fed, and it was, I have come to believe, the single most important lesson in warfare I ever learned, precisely because I did not learn it from anyone who had ever called themselves a warrior at all. Terrain. The preservation houses Inez Corvain had emptied that autumn were, in later years, restocked and expanded, becoming in time some of the largest granaries in the kingdom, run by her own successors in the office of salt keeper according to principles she had laid down in a private set of instructions that outlived her by more than a century. Know every road before you need it. Know every harvest before you rely on it. Know, above all, exactly how much any given stretch of countryside can feed an army passing through it, whether that army is your enemy's or your own, because the kingdom that understands its own land better than any invader ever could will never again need to win a war by fighting one. The 4 flooded mountain passes were, eventually, properly drained and made permanently passable, becoming in time ordinary trade routes indistinguishable from any other road in the kingdom, so that within 2 generations almost no one living along them remembered, or had any particular reason to remember, that they had once been deliberately, quietly ruined to break the back of an invading army, the way a scar, given enough years, becomes simply skin again. And the story behind it becomes simply a story, told at winter firesides more for its shape than for any lesson anyone still felt the need to draw from it. Only the salt keepers who succeeded Inez in her office kept the fuller account, passed down not as legend, but as something closer to a working manual, a set of maps, ledgers, and private instructions detailing exactly which passes flooded and when, which coastal villages could be relied upon for a quiet favor in a difficult season, which mountain drainage channels could be blocked or cleared within a fortnight by a handful of men who looked, to any distant observer, like nothing more than farmers tending their own land. It was not, any of them would have said, a treatise on war. It never claimed to be. It was simply the accumulated, unglamorous knowledge of a kingdom's own geography and its own people, kept current and complete by a line of officials whose only real distinction, across the many generations that followed Inez Corvain's death, was an unusually stubborn insistence that a kingdom's greatest defense was never its army at all, but the patient, dull, and largely invisible work of knowing, better than any enemy ever could, is exactly what the land beneath a marching army's feet would and would not provide. The 9 situations. Kettrig Vane, for his part, lived another 11 years after the disaster at Dunmark Gap, though he never again commanded a force larger than his own diminished clan host, and never again attempted an invasion of any kingdom beyond his own borders. In his old age, according to the few accounts that survive of his later years, he was known to tell the story of that autumn campaign to any who would listen, with a bitterness that had, by the end, mellowed into something closer to rueful admiration. "I marched south certain of victory," he was recorded as saying, in an account set down by one of his own grandsons some years after his death, commanding more men than that kingdom's entire standing army could have matched 3 times over, against a garrison that never once offered me the battle I wanted, and a countryside that seemed, at every turn, to have simply and quietly stopped providing whatever I needed most, exactly when I needed it, without my ever once being able to point to a single act of sabotage I could properly call an act of war. I have turned that campaign over in my mind for a decade, trying to name the moment I lost it, and I have come to believe there was no single moment. I lost it in 100 small moments, none of which looked like losing at the time, each of which I dismissed as bad luck, or poor foraging, or an unusually wet season, or the ordinary friction that attends any long campaign, until I woke one morning in the 10th week to discover that I had somehow, without ever fighting the battle I feared, already lost the war I had come to fight. I do not know the name of whoever arranged it. I have heard it was a woman who kept the kingdom's salt accounts, which seems to me either the greatest jest ever played upon a warlord or the most honest lesson I was ever taught, and I have never quite decided which. The use of spies, a final accounting. The true accounting of that autumn campaign, the full ledger of preservation houses relocated, fishing fleets quietly compensated, drainage channels blocked and later cleared, intermediaries paid to carry a rumor here and a private offer there, was never publicly recorded in any royal chronicle of King Belen's reign, which preferred, as royal chronicles generally do, to remember the affair as a triumph of General Rias's steadfast defense of the Denmark passes, a version of events that Rias himself, to his considerable credit, spent the rest of his life quietly and consistently correcting whenever anyone of sufficient importance asked him directly. The full ledger survived instead in the private archives of the royal salt monopoly, passed from salt keeper to salt keeper across the generations as part of the ordinary transfer of office, tucked among records of grain prices and coastal shipping rights and the annual reconciliation of preservation house inventories, a document that any casual reader, stumbling upon it without context, might easily have mistaken for nothing more than an unusually detailed account of one difficult trading season. Rather than the complete record of how a kingdom of 4,000 soldiers had defeated an invading host 5 times its size without ever fighting the war its enemy believed it was fighting at all. It was precisely this quality, the fact that the whole campaign could be read, by anyone who did not already know better, as merely a long and complicated season of ordinary trade, that Inez Corvain had considered, in her own private notes appended to the ledger near the end of her life, to be the truest measure of the thing's success. "The war well fought," she wrote, in the final entry of her own hand before the office passed to her successor, should be indistinguishable, to anyone who was not its author, from the ordinary business of a well-run kingdom going about its ordinary business. If the enemy cannot point to the moment he was defeated, he cannot avenge it, cannot learn from it in any way that serves his next attempt, and cannot even be entirely certain, in later years, that he was defeated by design rather than by his own poor judgment and the ordinary bad luck of an unusually wet autumn, and a defeat that a proud man can half convince himself was merely bad luck is a defeat he will not spend the next decade of his life plotting to avenge. That more than any battle won or any wall successfully held is the truest victory available to a kingdom too small to win its wars by force, not to defeat the enemy so thoroughly that he hates you for a generation, but to defeat him so quietly and so completely that he is left uncertain whether he was ever truly at war with you at all, and finds it easier in the end simply to go home and trade with you instead. I have spent my whole life keeping salt roads open between people who might otherwise have found reasons to distrust one another. It turns out in the end that keeping a kingdom's peace and keeping its salt roads open were never two different labors at all, but the very same one, looked at from two different and equally unglamorous angles, and I would rather be remembered, if I am remembered at all, for the roads I kept open than for any war I am said to have won, since the roads, unlike the war, are the part that actually lasted.